Now, one of the things I love about Yeats, and Yeats is hands down to me one of the greatest poets, not just of the modern period, but very possibly of all time. Um, he is, I would put him certainly in my top five of all time. That's how much I love him. I never tire of him. I think that he is hands down the greatest Irish poet. I think there's hardly a person in Ireland who would disagree with that. He's become almost a kind of uh, Irish god. If you ever go to Ireland, especially any of his areas where he grew up, there's so many museums and little statues to him. But I want to look at a poem that he wrote called Leda and the Swan, which I have, if any of you were in the creative writing class, I talked about this poem. And so here we go. I want to see if I can get my, there we go. So William Butler Yeats he's Irish, and he was very passionately Irish. He was very much not afraid to be a part of insurrectionist types of movements. He was very much involved in the Irish uprising. He very much wanted to see Ireland become independent of, of England, of Britain, wanted Ireland to become its own nation. But the problem with Ireland, and the thing that Yeats understood, is that there are two or three Irelands. And so that makes it kind of challenging because one of the, because when you have the Catholics, you have the Protestants who are warring against each other, you have those who are militantly independent, wanting to break free from Britain, and then you have those who feel a kind of loyalty to Britain and the British heritage. So you have these different strains of Ireland. And Yeats believed that the thing that would unite Ireland is if they could again come to know their own mythologies, which I totally agree with this, with every nation. If you want a nation to become a nation, you need to have mythology, stories in common. And if you want to disrupt things, you destroy those stories and those myths. And so he began to be a collector, if you will, of great Irish lore, of great Irish and Celtic mythology. He wrote a marvelous book that collects Celtic mermaid mythology, uh, Celtic mythology that he would write in story form, even for children. He would write Celtic and Irish myths into plays. He wanted the Irish people to see that they had a tradition that was older than the Ireland that they even remembered. Now, he had a love interest. He was married, but there was a woman named Maud Gonne. I should have written her name here. It's Maud, Maud, and her last name was Gonne, Gonne, Maud Gonne. And he adored her. They were essentially lovers, even though they were never married. And Yeats considered her his spiritual wife, if you will. He proposed to her many, many, many times, and she would always turn him down. She was very much into the big trend of the day, which is spiritualism. She loved spiritualism, and that got Yeats a little bit into it, where they would try to speak to spirits using a Ouija board and seances. Uh, and part of this came out of Yeats's own interest in old mythologies and things like that. So over and over again, he would try to get her to fall in love with him. I think she was in love with him. She just didn't want to be married to him because she was afraid that that would tie her down. She was a rather unusual woman. She had a great deal of influence in that sort of spiritualistic what they called theosophical world, um, where where the popularity of things like tarot uh, and the popularity of trying to find commonalities in myths and religions. So he considered her his muse, and so many of his poems have a kind of have a kind of love poem feel, even when it has nothing to do with love. And Yeats said that was because he often wrote wanting Maud Gonne to fall in love with him. Now, one of the most important things that happened in Yeats's life, in many Irish intellectuals' life, is what we call the Irish uprising. It kind of depends on who you're asking. So the Irish called it the Easter uprising, because it was essentially on Easter weekend that the Irish took up arms and began to attack the British, hoping that the Irish people would rise up as well and take up arms and fight back with the British. It didn't go very well for the Irish. The British came in, stamped it down pretty quickly. The British call it the Irish Rebellion. And as a result, they rounded up the leaders of the Irish Rebellion or the Easter Uprising. And this was in 1916. And they were killed by firing squad. And this actually forced Yeats in part to leave Ireland, in part because he was very much an outspoken proponent of the uprising. And this made him a little bit, this put him, let's say, in a bad way for a while among the British. And it also disappointed Yeats. Yeats felt great disappointment in the Irish people because he really believed that the Irish people would somehow join the revolution, and they didn't. And so in his disappointment, he left Ireland and lived most of the rest of his life on the continent, but writing always about Ireland. Um, Incidentally, this is an interesting picture. I love this picture where we have Yeats on the left, and then you have T.S. Eliot on the right, and they're meeting for the first time. They had written letters. They were very aware of each other. Eliot liked to argue that Yeats was the greatest poet in English, and that's high praise coming from Eliot. They finally got to meet. They're actually in America meeting, giving lectures. And so this famous meeting was captured on camera. And I love this, and I'd love to know what that conversation was like. They both had incredible admiration for each other. But I want you to also notice, I don't think this is a small thing. Maybe I'm making a big deal of a small thing. Notice how nicely dressed they are. This is so different than the way we think of poets today, where they seem to be dressed all kind of ragged, and uh, they have that kind of bohemian look about them. That would be romantic. The romantics are doing that sort of a thing. But you have to remember that the moderns are responding, they're reacting to that sort of poetry that's just about the heart bleeding all over the audience. And instead, writing about ideas, writing about things of great importance, and pulling on a tradition of literature that many would understand, that you would need an education. You would need to be an educated person in some ways to read them. So I want to talk about Leda and the Swan, which is in your book, and it's a sonnet. Leda and the Swan comes from a myth, a Greek myth, And I'd like to share that myth if I may. So he Yeats is assuming, as do most of the moderns, that his audience is well educated, that his audience is well read, at least. And by educated, I don't mean like they went to the university. It just means that they've read and they understand, and they um, so so he's pulling on a very important myth in Greek and Roman mythology. So Leda was an incredibly beautiful woman in Greek mythology, just spectacularly beautiful. And Zeus, the god Zeus, saw her and desperately wanted to have her. And Zeus is just the horniest god. He just can't seem to keep, he can't keep the zipper up. And every time he sees either a goddess or a mortal that strikes him as beautiful, he immediately wants to take her to bed. So he sees Leda and he wants her really badly. The problem is Leda's husband is around, and he's very powerful, but also Hera, Zeus's wife, gets very angry when Zeus goes and starts boinking every goddess or mortal that he finds. That's a mythological term, boinking everyone he sees. And the so he's a little worried. How is he going to be able to have his way with Leda when she's got a husband and Hera is constantly on the lookout? And that's the biggest thing he's worried about with the husband. Not that he can't overpower the husband, but he might tell Hera. Well, one day though, when her husband is gone on a trip, she decides she's going to take a bath. So she goes out into a pond and she is taking a bath. And so she's there naked in the pond. And so Zeus gets this great idea and he makes himself into a swan. Now, who's going to suspect anything nefarious about a swan, right? It's a beautiful bird. So the swan flies in and lands in the pond. And so she doesn't think anything of it when the swan swims up to her. And essentially, now it depends on which story you read, rapes her. And now the problem, of course, is this is Zeus, so she's not going to be powerful enough to withstand that. Not only that, he is Zeus, and so she doesn't fight too hard as well because, well, he's Zeus. Well, I don't want to get into much more detail than that. Why is this story relevant at all? The reason why this story is relevant is that Leda, who's a mortal, becomes pregnant. Now, whoever she gives birth to will be, half god, half mortal, not quite a god, but with special powers, of course, of being a demigod. And she's going to give birth to a woman named Helen. And Helen, of course, is the most beautiful woman who ever lived. So much so that Helen is going to be pivotal in the central myth for both the Greeks and the Romans, and that is the Trojan War. Because Helen is going to marry the king of Sparta, Menelaus, but trying to cause division, the goddess Eris, she decides, and Eris is the goddess of chaos. So she wants to create some chaos. So she strikes Helen, Leda's daughter, with the arrow of Eros, what we would think of as Cupid, and also the son of the king of Troy, Paris. And so Paris and Helen fall madly in love, and they run off to Troy. Menelaus does a very manlike thing when, you know, your wife has run off with another man. He pulls together a bunch of kings and says, let's go to the city and let's go kill everybody. And so they go and they have a 10-year war trying to get Helen back and try to kill everybody in Troy to get Helen back. That's why this story matters. But the reason why it matters is that this little incident that seems so small, like something that hardly anyone noticed over in this little pond over here, turns out to be the pivotal thing that causes the greatest war of all time, the Trojan War, and the central myth. That's going to fascinate Yeats, because Yeats is fascinated with the thought that a little thing, a little event can turn the entire world for good or for ill, and in this case for ill. And I love this particular painting. This is actually a 20th century painting. Here we have, I'll show you one. This is actually Michelangelo, and this is the one that Yeats is writing about. He's looking at this painting, and one thing you'll notice, if any of you enjoy art like I do, one of the things I will say about Michelangelo is he is incapable of painting women who look like women. Because I just feel like, I mean, she is like the manliest, buffest looking woman. Yes, she's got breasts, but she's, you know, that's Michelangelo, because that's, I think, how he would prefer his women to look. This is the picture, this is the painting that Yeats is looking at when he writes this poem. And here I'm going to read the poem. So please follow with me. Now, it's a sonnet. It's a 14-line poem with a very specific rhyme scheme. It's not a Shakespearean sonnet. It's more of the Italian style sonnet in its rhyme scheme. So he's describing what's taking place here. So here it is. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? How can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead, being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air. Did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? So he's essentially describing a very violent, horrific act here. But he's assuming that you know some things about the story. He's assuming you know who Leda is. So he's assuming you know that she is the mother of Helen, that this violent act is going to give birth to Helen, that is going to ultimately cause this horrific war. And Agamemnon here is the king of Athens. Agamemnon is the one that Menelaus will come to, and Menelaus and Agamemnon will wield all the kings in their armies and bring about this war. Agamemnon's dead because when he comes back after victory, his wife kills him, for good reason in some ways, because Agamemnon, in order to get good winds, because he couldn't get the wind to blow his ship, so he had his daughter sacrificed to the gods. Well, his wife, Clytemnestra, is really ticked off about that, and she has 10 years to think about it. So when Agamemnon comes back, she prepares a bath for him, and while he's in the bath, she stabs him and kills him. So in other words, from this what seems like just a small event in world history, yes, a horrible and violent act, but it's actually going to affect lots of people. And it's going to have it's going to cause so many dead in the Great Trojan War. And this is very much how Yeats looks at the world, that small, horrific things that few people notice can actually have consequential effects on the world. It's marvelous. And he's writing this not far away from World War II. And he himself kind of is feeling the sense that something ominous is coming, or as Eliot said, waiting for the next shoe to drop after World War One for World War II to start. It's marvelous. It's such a perfect poem that I go back and forth between this poem and Eliot's The Wasteland, for which one is the essential 20th century poem. I'd love for you to read that one on your own. It's in your book. And those of you who are poets, because I know we have several poets in the class. Think about what you write, and try your hand perhaps at writing about big ideas. I know the trend right now is to write that sort of confessional poetry, but try your hand at writing large ideas that come from allusions to large ideas. It may bring about some great poetry. And the last poem I would really love to share from him is a poem he wrote when he was younger. And this was a love poem he wrote to Maud Gonne. He desperately wanted her to marry him, and he gave her this poem hoping that she would say yes. And this is the poem he wrote. And it's called He Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, and wrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. I love that. So he's just basically saying here, I'm going to put here in front of you, everything I have to give, which is just my dreams. So be gentle. And she was not. So he was brokenhearted in that way. I love that. That's as close to a confessional poem as Yeats would ever get. I asked you to read Yeats, and I'm just kind of curious if anyone had a response to him. And if you did, feel free to you can push down the space bar and say something. And so does anyone have a thought or comment want to say about how they felt about Yeats's poetry? Did you like it? Did you not like it?
I can share, I guess. I liked it. I also had no idea what was going on for a lot of it, especially the one that was like talking about like dolphin blood and it. Yeah, I did not know what was going on there. I had to look it up and then I still don't really get it, but that's fine. It was still pretty to read.
Yeah, so he's of course talking about with all of Yeats, he is writing about things that he makes assumptions about what we know, and we don't know. And so he's writing about this, what he thinks is this ideal of of a society. He's kind of come to the place, he's getting old in that poem, and he just feels that, maybe there's not room enough anymore for an old man. I know kind of how he feels. You feel like the world is, if you want a utopian world, get rid of the old men like us. And when he says that is no country for old men, um, the that there's this ideal world out there, and I'm too old for it. But maybe the young could reimagine what he hopes for someday. It's but I do that's one of his most famous poems, but not one of my favorites, because I often feel like it's a little like, is he like dropping some acid? But could anyone else have a reaction, like a positive, negative? I'll look forward to the reactions maybe that you have in the question I have about that's in Canvas. I'm excited to see what you have to say, and I hope you have a great weekend. Do I always say this, but I mean this in all seriousness. Do something good for your soul. No matter what you're stressed about at school, none of it is as important as you and who you are. And so, along with, yes, do homework, yes, do some of those things, do something good for your mind and your heart. Read a book that has nothing to do with schoolwork. Have a great conversation. Go on a walk. Um, look at the world. Um, Realize that there's more to the world than maybe I was seeing before. Maybe try your hand at a poem. Try your hand at thinking on an idea that's larger than yourself. Maybe go to church. Um, try a little church. Do something good for yourself. Anyway, I will see you all, and thank you for coming in. And if anyone has any questions, stick around. Otherwise, I will see you all on Monday. So, bye-bye.
Have a good day.